Well, welcome to question 63 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this week is the respect of persons. And this is a particularly interesting topic this week, although it looks very common. The respect of persons should be very straightforward. It's actually very interesting. And I'm Dr. Thibault. Uh, if you were to think about the respect of persons, you would typically think this might be a virtue. Obviously, we should respect people, right? We're taught that at an early age that we should respect one another. But what St. Thomas is writing about in this section is the sin of persons as a sin. It's a sin. Um, Interesting if you were to look this topic up on YouTube, most of the people who talk about this are typically Pentecostals and evangelicals who go on quite a bit about this. So perhaps whoever is watching this video right now might be somebody doing research from a Pentecostal tradition. So if you do, well, welcome to the Summa. Um, this topic is, I think it's connected primarily to the scriptures, because the scripture, you see repeatedly this idea that you do not respect any man's person. Is really the grace of God. It's not the person who deserves to be praised. And the letter of St. James spends a lot of time on this, and we'll get into James later on, so I won't go into it too deeply here. Um, where does this question fit into the Summa? Well, this is the only vice associated with the distributive theories of justice. In the distributive theories of justice, if you want more detail on that, go back to question 61. But in short, it's the relationship between the whole, which usually is society, the government, and the individual, or the family, the whole, the family to the individual, the person, or the whole of the church to the individual, the person. So it's, and the opposite of that is commutative justice, which is between two equal individuals, between two individuals. And this is dealing with the whole to the part. So the vice about how society is distributing its benefits and its burdens, um, the great danger to that is respect of persons, which is essentially not treating all people as equal. So if if we were to look at, well, what is the danger of community life? Well, unequal treatment of individuals. Equality here, though, is there's asterisks next to this, which we will also get into. What does it mean? As I always jump ahead a bit. If somebody is promoted to a prelacy, which is a position of honor and responsibility within the church, uh, or professorship, because he is rich or because he is a relative of somebody who's influential, this is what they call respective person. So when you have a respective person, you are respecting the person for the wrong set of circumstances. You're respecting them because of their wealth, which often at this time people have not even earned themselves, so there's not even any virtue associated with the skill in order to acquire the wealth. One was born into the wealth, or because of one's family members, which again, one doesn't have any virtue in acquiring one's family members. One has happened upon it by circumstance. So these aren't things which should be honored. They should be. We should be looking at the character of a person, not simply one's um, luck of the draw of it, how one is being born into the world. Um, St. Thomas does give an exception for something like receiving an estate where is often the heirs of somebody who receives the estate. That's fine. If you, if you inherit the wealth of your family, well, that's fine. It's not a scandal to inherit the wealth of your family. It's not an injustice to inherit the wealth of your family. But if the church were to give you a bishopric, all of this money and power over a see, an ecclesiastical see, because your family is connected. Well, that would be a scandal, and it would be injustice in that regard, because it really belongs to the people, not to your family. It belongs to the whole community. Um, so that's different. The same thing, I guess, with politics as well. some of these positions, if you're going to tax everyone, then it should be properly distributed, not simply, a piggy bank for a particular few people at the top. The other part, which it ties into this, but it's not directly addressed because we're not dealing with the modern times, but the issue of race would also play into this. So if you were to favor someone simply because they are white, we call that racism, but under the Summa, you will never find the term racism. It didn't exist yet. But this respect of persons would definitely be the medieval interpretation of racism, where you aren't judging a person based on their character and their virtue, but simply based on their race, something which they were born into and had no say in. And because of this, this would be you are judging the person um, based on the wrong set of circumstances, the wrong set of criteria to properly judge a person. Um, Whereas in the modern day, we talk about racism, and then some people talk about reverse racism and how reverse racism isn't a thing. St. Thomas would be uh, have a maybe more easy interpretation of this because for him, uh, if you anytime you were to judge a person based on something other than their virtue, and the honors which are due to them because of their virtue, um, you're improperly judging a person. So if you were to give somebody a position simply because they were black, or simply because they were white, or simply because of one of these external factors which has no bearing on the character of the person, then that would be the wrong set of criteria. So, race, again, would be one which would be an irrelevant criteria, which should not be included in properly making a decision about a person's character and the respect one gets. One doesn't lose respect because one is one race or another. Because of the time, probably the single issue that would divide a community would be probably wealth, wealth and power. Some ways not that different than today. So, Article 3 is dedicated to this issue of wealth, and Saint Augustine, when he's on the letter of St. James, he says, uh, "Who is it that who would tolerate the promotion of a rich man to a position of honor in the church, to the exclusion of a poor man more learned and holier?" I don't think St. Augustine had foreseen the future of the church with its Medici and Borgia popes, but we could probably see today that there are people of great wealth who have greater honors, maybe less today than 200 or 300 years ago, but there certainly was times when wealth did influence position. Uh, and St. Thomas, when he talks about this, really he says it's really about, I'll quote him exactly, respect of the person is sin. I apologize. Went out for a second. The respective person is a sin insofar as it is contrary to justice, is what he says. So it would be unjust to select a person based on their wealth rather than the person based on their virtue. Uh, that should be somewhat self-evident that we should choose people based on their virtue. Uh, but it's really a sin against justice that you would do that. Now, how does he suggest that we should select a person for their positions within the church, within society? He says we can do it just once, simply and absolutely, which is to judge a person based on their character alone, and that's enough. So, if a person has spiritual gifts, they had learning, they have good virtue, good piety, um, then simply select that person. That would be the most obvious, judging a person based on their character alone. The second one, he says, is, well, sometimes though it is better to choose the lesser person, because they can sometimes do more good for the common good. So again, he says this isn't really respect of person, because you're not picking the lesser person because they are your cousin or your uncle or your friend, or because they're rich or because they have Instagram followers, something like that. You're not choosing them for that reason, but because they have a different set of skills, which sometimes their brokenness makes them stronger. Um, Sometimes said that God keeps the venial sins in some of the greatest saints because it keeps them humble. So their brokenness makes them more relatable to other people. And we can see that there's probably some truth to it. If we think of some of the best church pastors, they're people who are both spiritual and have strong devotion. Their their thoughts are in the heavens, but their feet are firmly rooted on the ground, which would make a good pastor. If somebody is more lofty and their mind is more in the heavens than on the earth, they might make a terrific monk, but they might not make a very good church pastor. Particularly in a middle income parish in the United States. Sometimes uh, you have to be able to play a little bit of golf and to watch the baseball games in order to be more relatable to the people, and hopefully you can use that relatableness to bring forth greater spiritual good, not just to debase the faith, but to bring people, from their commonness to uh, their greatness. Sometimes, as Francis said, you want your shepherds to smell like the sheep a little. So maybe having a little bit of relatableness can be helpful. Although, if we were to look at this is really not then saying that you are choosing a lesser person. In some ways, their set of skills is the greater set of skills for that particular community. Therefore, it's not. It isn't really lesser. Lesser in some ways, but not lesser in all ways. Not everyone is meant to be a great monk. That's okay. Um, but people have to be called to their state of life. So I think there's, it's not as negative as it sounds, choosing the lesser person. Again, it's not necessarily the lesser person. St. Thomas, he also points out that God himself often chooses the lesser person to do his work. If you look, St. Peter had a bit of a temper. St. Paul persecuted the church. Uh, Moses had a stutter. God doesn't choose perfect people. He chooses those who he calls, which are often the lesser of the people. He chooses King David, the youngest son, the scrawny one, to fight Goliath, because he had more courage, but not because he was stronger. So it's saying don't judge people based on their worldly skills, but maybe look at their deeper skills, true gift of discernment. So again, some people naturally fit into their role, and some people you could say, well, they were chosen so and so is greater than them. Well, there are greater people, but sometimes the person chosen is the right person for the job, not necessarily the holiest. Now, he does talk about types of useful nepotism, and really that's what we're talking about with this is nepotism. Um, the respected person is really nepotism. And there is some usefulness to it. So if we look to a situation like Pius IV during the Counter Reformation, he chose his nephew, and he was a Medici pope. He chose his nephew, Charles Borromeo, to become a leader within the church and eventually a cardinal. Um, And this turned out to work very well. The church was very divided at the time. You had a lot of infighting. To have somebody in a key position who you knew was competent and you knew who was trustworthy and faithful to you was an important two or very important virtues. All a very competent person who wasn't very faithful to you could have led to greater divisions. So to have somebody who was both competent and faithful in assuming your nephew will be more faithful to you than a stranger, it worked well. It worked well. St. Charles Borromeo, at 12 years old, he received the tonsure and received all the wealth from monasteries that his family were connected with, uh, from a very well-off family. And he decided at the age of 12 that he would use that money to fund his education to become a priest, and anything beyond that would be given to the poor. That he didn't want any of that money from the monastery to go to any worldly desires. And St. Charles lived very poorly, even as a cardinal, he lived very poorly. Even as an archbishop of Milan, he lived very poorly. And he did wonderful, marvelous things. And the fact that he was the nephew of the Pope when he became a cardinal, it didn't hurt him at all. It was the right choice. But we can also look to people like Pope Alexander VI, who chose his illegitimate son to become a cardinal. The little Valentine, Cesare Borgia, and he was, I think, the only cardinal to ever resign his position because he was more dedicated to womanizing and fighting wars than he was to being dedicated to the church. And Machiavelli wrote about him in The Prince, um, being very politically cunning, but not particularly called to a life in the church. So that would be a failure. This would be what St. Thomas would have been guarding against, would be that type of nepotism. You never quite know though with people. Uh, you never know. Cesare Borgia, he could have had a conversion at some point and became a phenomenal saint. He didn't, but he could have. And Charles Borromeo, Saint Charles Borromeo, could have gone the other way as well. You never quite know. But St. Thomas does say it's better to not engage in nepotism because there's always this suspicion of scandal. Even when Charles Borromeo was chosen, people talked about it. It's not popular to choose your own family to positions of authority, but sometimes it works for the greater glory of God. So therefore, sometimes it's allowed. Right intentions go into it. When we look at this from the letter of St. James, when we go into Article 3, it's seen, the respective person is seen as a sin. Whoever honors the rich for their riches engages in sin. It's sin to honor the rich for being rich. Um, this is what St. Augustine was talking about in his homily. Um, if a person is honored for any reason other than virtue, it would be a sin. That's coming from St. Thomas. So, uh, whether it's wealth, whether it's not to get political, but when people talk about that we need a woman in the White House, so we need a black person in the White House, we need, you know, one of these other, we need minority in a certain position. If in some way there's a utility to it, the Supreme Court should mirror the people. Congress should mirror its constituencies. It's to some sense there's some truth in this, but this idea that this identity politics that you know we need a woman in the White House because a woman is what is needed. Well, or we need a black person in the White House, or we need a white person. Some on the other side, you had people saying we need a man in the White House, we need a white person in the White House. Um, these things would be the circumstances of life which are not determinative of a person's virtue. So if the position should be given to the person of the proper virtue, um, and you're not choosing people based on their proper virtue, you're basing them on some of these other factors, then you are sinning. It's the wrong criteria. Um, uh, St. Thomas says virtue alone is what we should honor. We should be honoring the virtue of a person. Um, he does point out, though, that we do honor people because of their relationships and their roles, as well as those who simply have the virtue. So if he says, if you look at princes and prelates, they often they should be honored. They should be given respect, uh, not particularly because of their personal position, though. Not It's not a personal respect. It's respect of office, as we often say. Like, you may not like the president of the United States, but you have to respect the office. Right? The same thing he would say with people within the church. Even St. Thomas said sometimes there's terrible princes and sometimes there's terrible prelates. um, just because a person is a bishop doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be a good person. There are some people who turn out not to be good people when they're bishops or princes or presidents. But we should, as parts of this whole, we should still show them respect. Now, they might have a much more difficult final judgment because of the great responsibility that has been put on their shoulders. um, well, our role is not to be their final judge. Our role should be still, in every attempt, to show the dignity to their position because God has placed them where they are and allows them to be where they are. The president or the prince represents the community, the prelate sits in God's name. Um, if they sin, it's going to be on them, but it shouldn't fall to us. It is our job not to be sheep in a crass sense, but we should try our very best to honor them, to respect them. In a similar way that we show respect to parents, which is the next category, which parents share in the dignity of God. They're co-creators. God gave you life in this world, and you did it through your parents. So to show them honor is proper. It's not, again, because of their person necessarily, but because of your relationship to them, which is the interesting part. Now, other people might not honor them because they're not their parents, but you should because they're your parents, because there's a particular relationship there. He also then talks about age should be honored as a sign of virtue, which maybe this is less so in a modern American household because of this. Almost everyone lives to an old age. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a sign of virtue, but in other cultures where it's a little tougher, you might not make it to old age if you're not smart. If you didn't work hard, if you didn't have a good family, you might not have made it. You die of something before you got old. Uh, but even St. Thomas points out that it's not automatic that just because you've made it to old age that you're virtuous. There's plenty of old people who are not virtuous. But he says, still in general, we should probably show some preference to the elderly and show them some additional respect because they probably have additional wisdom and virtue that others don't. And he says as well that even though he talks about for an entire question that article that the rich should not be particularly honored, he does say, well, the rich should be honored in a particular type of way as well because of their role within community. So if a person is rich because they own a factory where they're employing the majority of the town, well, you're not just respecting them because they're rich, but because of they've given everyone a job. If the person is very generous and they help fund the church, they should be honored for their generosity. If they help charities and help feed the poor, well, they should be honored for the good that they did with their money. So there's a lot of things with wealth which a person can gain honor from, and that's fine if what they do with their wealth is honorable. But St. Thomas points out very clearly that honoring somebody simply because they are rich is not a good reason. If you honor them only because they are the amount of money they have, then that is a sin. I suppose you could then apply that to all of them, all of these categories. There's a good rich person, a good old person, a good parent, a good prince and prelate should be honored because of their role and their duties, but uh, there's always exceptions. Is the respect for persons in a judicial sentencing, which is an interesting one in the last of the articles of this section. Uh, and he says, this is kind of a tough one. I don't have a lot of notes on it, but a judge is the role of a judge is to create equality. That's the primary goal of a judge. So um, when a judge is judging in a certain situation, being judicial, uh, he should not give preference to anyone in particular because of respective person. So you shouldn't give preference to the wealthy person, but you should also not give preference, according to St. Thomas, to the poor person. Uh, Certain people have certain abilities and disabilities. Um, you know, he points out repeatedly this idea that if you were to punch the prince, you might have a much heavier sentence than if the prince punched you because of his role. Similarly, I guess, with a bishop or your parent or a rich person or an elderly person, right? Because they have these kind of classes. Um, if an old person punched you, it would be different than if you punched an old person. Um, this kind of idea. But the ultimate goal of the judge then is to look at the virtue of the individuals, their roles, their relationships, and some people are higher than other people in some regards because of virtue, right? Some people, if you were to hit Mother Teresa, for example, when she was still alive, that would be a worse thing to do than um, hitting somebody else because of her holiness, her virtue, her goodness. Um, so, in some sense, that we're not the aim of this is not perfect equality within this. It's not perfect equality, but it is a restoring of the proper order in some sense. So it's not to disproportionately injure anyone. So, you because you're rich and you walk into court, you don't get any preference simply because you're rich. If you are a good, generous, upright, upstanding member of society, you should be treated as a good, upstanding member of society. You shouldn't be treated like you're not. So people should be treated as they are, which is kind of an interesting point. And the goal of the judge is kind of restore that natural order of things. But in some sense, they call it equality. But it's not that everyone is perfectly equal, but it returns kind of that natural order to things. Um, and it really would be against this idea of this respect of persons that somebody gets extra bonus points just because of who they are. Um, In conclusion, when we look at respect to persons, it's sin. If it violates distributive justice, the only vice to just in the section of distributive justice, it does not consider the proper circumstances. If you're judging somebody based on their wealth or because of their race, those are the improper circumstances. A lesser person can be chosen if it's for the common good. Uh, if you honor a person rightly, you should recognize the person for their virtue. That's the most important thing. And a judicial sentence should restore justice as its final goal. And next, we will get into the vices of communicative injustice. Look forward to that.